So to give a bit of service context, I work at Northwick Park Mental Health Unit, which is in North London in England. We've got 2 adult mixed-sex psychiatric wards, and they've each got 18 beds. So we have 18 service users on each ward. Our thresholds for admission are really, really high due to the demand on mental health services, and we're therefore working with people in crisis who are presenting in extreme states of distress. So on average, our length of stay, it says here, is around 3 to 4 weeks, but over the last year to 6 months, that's actually reduced quite dramatically. And I think on our last data, just before I went on leave for this conference, it was around 16 days that we're sitting at. So it's an incredibly short amount of time that we've got to work with people and think about how we can best support them in these really high states of distress. So when I started at the ward in 2017, the unit was working from a primarily medical model. So diagnosis was the main way that we were understanding people's distress or their mental health difficulties, and there was also limited intervention being offered other than medication. So there were also some real issues with our wards, one of the main ones being that we were highest in the trust for our use of restrictive interventions. So that's the use of restraint, the use of seclusion, and the use of rapid tranquilization. And we were also an outlier nationally for incidents of violence and aggression on our wards. And this was sort of in relation to lots of the restrictive interventions. So there were lots of incidents of violence and aggression, and staff were managing that with a lot of restrictive practice. So our nursing staff also really spoke about feeling really low in terms of morale. So they felt that their roles had been very much reduced to policing, to handing out medication and observing. And understandably, as a result, we were finding it really, really hard to recruit, and we were finding that people were leaving very quickly. So we knew that the current model wasn't really working, and actually there being some issues provided us with a bit of a context to try and do something a little bit differently. And over the last 4 years, we've been developing a trauma-informed model of care for our inpatient wards, and most of this talk is going to be telling you a little bit about what we've done and how that's worked in practice. But before I kick off with that, what I'm just going to do is spend a bit of time introducing you to trauma-informed practice and some of the research behind it for anyone that's new to that. Okay. So, trauma-informed practice draws on evidence from the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs, as they're more commonly referred to, studies, as well as lots of other research, which has really clearly demonstrated that many mental health difficulties can be seen as responses to trauma, abuse, neglect, and other adversities such as war and social conflict. So the trauma-informed approach focuses on how our mind and how our bodies might be affected by emotionally overwhelming events in the outside world, and how actually trauma and adversity around us can affect our internal biological processing. So for example, in the form of hyperarousal, panic, I always get a tongue twister when I say this one, but the fight, flight, fight response, experiencing flashbacks and memory fragmentation, or dissociation, where our mind and our body might cut off and shut down in order to protect us from what's going on around us, or also what might be going on inside us. So trauma-informed practice suggests new ways forward that cut across diagnostic categories, and we're going to give some examples of some of the ways that we've implemented this on our wards in a few slides' time. Right slide. So from a trauma-informed approach, we might think about people as still living in trauma time. So people's minds and their bodies are actually still responding or reacting as they did at the time of the trauma. So symptoms are not seen as meaningless biological expressions of an illness. Instead, we're thinking about people as displaying meaningful survival responses that were necessary at the time of the trauma, but actually might have outlived their usefulness or become problems within their own right. So for example, if we think about a young boy or a young child that grew up in the context of domestic violence, who's now struggling with voices telling him other people are dangerous, you need to stay inside, don't trust anyone else. That might have been really, really helpful as a child to keep him safe. That might have been the only way he was able to survive. But actually now, in adulthood, when the context has changed, it's not so helpful, and it's stopping that person from engaging in perhaps more reparative and healing relationships. So instead of thinking about people in distress as patients with illnesses and thinking about what's wrong with people, the trauma-informed approach really pushes towards this idea of asking people what has happened to you. And this represents a really major shift away from a medical deficit model of distress. So it's been really influential in the US and the UK mental health services, but also in other sectors such as the criminal justice system and also within education. And I'm not sure if anyone's heard of the long-term plan. I'm assuming probably not, because most people in London haven't heard of it, or in England haven't heard of it, and it's really important there. But in England, basically, it's the bit of policy that lays out all of the research-based recommendations of what we're supposed to be doing in our national health services over the next 10 years. So it's a massive document, and mental health gets very, very small amount of time in this document. But one of the things that is really clear, one of the core points that it says, is that over the next 10 years, mental health services should be trauma-informed. So I guess it's really important to state at this point that trauma-informed practice is not just backed up by evidence, but it's also recommended within core policy about how we should be running our services. Okay. Well, have I been... Oh, sorry, no, I'm going backwards. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs studies now, which I touched on earlier. So this is one of the really influential pieces of research behind trauma-informed practice, and it doesn't just represent one study, it represents hundreds of studies that have involved over 17,000 participants who've all been followed up over 15 years. And what this research found initially were 10 different types of adversity that someone might experience in childhood that can lead to negative consequences later in life in terms of people's mental health, in terms of their physical health, and also in terms of social issues. So the 10 ACEs, I'm just going to list them off here, include physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, exposure to domestic abuse, household substance abuse, household mental illness, parental separation, and having a member of household in prison. There's also been subsequent research on this with other aspects such as bullying and adult trauma, and also they've looked into factors associated with deprivation, such as knife crime or racism. So on this next slide here, we can see just some of the consequences of having a higher number of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, in your early life or in your later life. And as you can see, mental health difficulties, such as having a diagnosis of depression, psychosis, suicidality, are all listed, alongside a range of physical health issues, such as migraine, fibromyalgia, obesity, and also a range of social issues, such as homelessness and unemployment. There's a really good website if people are interested in understanding more about the ACEs. It's called acestoohigh.com, but if you just Google ACEs, there's lots of information out there about it. And it's not just the ACEs research that demonstrates this relationship between trauma and adversity and the subsequent mental health difficulties. So the statistics that I've put here are from several systematic reviews and meta-analyses of the existing literature, and the figures specifically that I've chosen to present focus mostly on a psychiatric inpatient population due to the nature of this workshop. But as you can see from what's up on the slide, these statistics suggest that 85% of people who have an admission to a psychiatric inpatient unit have had experiences of childhood sexual abuse, and 63% have reported experiences of domestic violence just in the 1 year prior to that admission. So for male psychiatric patients, 85% of people interviewed reported that they'd experienced at least one type of abuse in childhood. And more widely, research has shown that 98% of people in contact with psychiatric services who hear voices have reported experiencing at least one trauma. And 75% of people with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder have reported experiencing sexual abuse in childhood. So I think these figures are shocking. They shock me every time I show them, and I think they should be. I think that's a good thing. But perhaps more shocking is how unacknowledged this relationship often is between trauma and mental health within the services that we work. And somehow it can feel easier that we diagnose or pathologize women in distress who might have experienced abuse as having disordered personalities, rather than actually locating the issue within the context and the things that have happened to this person. Okay. So this is a study by Shevlin and colleagues, and they looked at the relationship between child abuse and psychosis. And what they found, that for children that had experienced one type of abuse, they were 9.3 times more likely to develop psychosis than someone who hadn't experienced abuse in childhood. So when that was increased to 3 kinds of abuse in childhood, the risk of developing psychosis increased to 18 times more likely. And when that was increased to 5 types of abuse, the risk of developing psychosis compared to someone who has not experienced abuse in childhood is 193 times more likely to develop psychosis. And yet, despite research like this, we're still trying to search for alternatives in the form of biological cause. And I guess for me, this slide really highlights just the importance of always coming back to this question around what has happened to you. So there was a really interesting paper, I think it was released in 2020 in the UK by John Reed and some of his colleagues, and they did a Freedom of Information request, and they looked at all of the notes, or they requested notes from National Health Service, mental health services, to see actually were clinicians routinely asking people about their experiences. And interestingly, the group that are less likely or least likely to be routinely asked about experiences of trauma are people with psychosis. And yet we have data like this, it doesn't quite add up. Okay. So more recently, there's also been a lot of research that's been looking at the roots of trauma and the context from which it can arise. So this is a really nice paper by Ellis and Dietz, and the reference is there on the bottom, it's freely accessible. And it looks at how adverse community environments, such as poverty, discrimination, and violence, can give rise to individual experience of adversity during childhood. So as you can see on the image, the roots, those represents the adverse community environments, and the leaves, those are the adverse childhood experiences. So it's a really nice and very readable paper, so I'd recommend having a look if you're interested in learning more. Okay, just to see how I'm doing for time. So I've given a bit of summary of what the trauma-informed approach is and some of the research behind it, but what does this actually look like in practice? So from a trauma-informed approach, intervention, or perhaps supporting people to recover and move forwards, could be thought about in 3 phases, and I've got them listed up here on the slide. So the first phase, we often call this stabilization, and it's all about understanding the relationship between what has happened in your past, what has happened to you, and the current difficulties that you might be experiencing, as well as learning skills to support that individual to feel safe, to feel stable, and to feel more able to cope. Phase 2 is often called the remembering phase, and this might involve talking about or processing and coming to terms with the past and what has happened. And phase 3, which is often called the moving forwards phase, is about moving forwards and finding ways to take up life again and re-engage with the things that are important to the individual. So it's really important to note that people don't necessarily have to do all of these phases, and also we might not work through them in a sequential order, so people might go backwards and forwards. So where I work in an acute inpatient setting, given that people are with us for very short periods of time and they're presenting with really high levels of distress, the majority of work that we're doing is focusing around phase 1 stabilization, and that's what we're going to talk a bit more about. Okay. So it's also really important to acknowledge that trauma-informed care is not just about individual interventions and the way we work with people, but it's about a whole systems level change. So whole mental health systems, not just our individual clinicians, need to acknowledge that the majority of people we work with in mental health services, addiction services, in the criminal justice system, in welfare system, have had experiences of trauma and adversity in their histories, and that actually our services have the real potential to harm and be unintentionally re-traumatizing. So in order to resist this, staff need to be appropriately trained and supported to work with trauma. So trauma-informed systems need to acknowledge that unresolved trauma creates problems down the generations. So for example, the ongoing impact of colonialism, of slavery, of war trauma. And I think one of the things that's also really important to hold in mind, and this is something we have on our ward sort of plastered up in posters everywhere, is every interaction is an intervention. So this means that every interaction we have with someone has the potential to provide that individual with a different, healing, and reparative relational experience. And this is something we can all walk out of here and do. Okay. So, a bit of a plug here. Lucy's going to hold up the manual. So we're going to move on to talking a little bit about how we've put some of these ideas into practice on our psychiatric wards. and 2 of the core trauma-informed practices that we've developed. So the first practice I'm going to talk about is this idea of stabilisation, and this manual here that Lucy's holding up for us is our stabilisation manual. So we actually adapted this from a manual that Lucy and her colleagues in Wales originally developed. And what it's got in it is one introductory session, which gives an overview of trauma-informed approaches and what we mean by that. And then it's got 10 stabilisation skills sessions. So the skills are all psychological skills, and they're all evidence-based across a range of difficulties that we might see people presenting with on our inpatient wards. So for example, voices, suicidality, paranoia, dysregulation. And they all are around supporting individuals to develop a greater sense of internal safety. So I'm not going to talk you through all of the skills listed on the slide, but they include skills such as self-compassion, mindfulness, breathing, relaxation. So every service user, when they come onto our ward for admission, they're given a copy of this manual when they're admitted, and all service users are offered one-to-one sessions with ward staff to practice and work out which are most useful to them. We also have weekly stabilisation groups running every week on both of our inpatient wards where service users can attend. And then in terms of our staff, because it was really, really important actually that this wasn't just something that psychology did, like in a room by themselves in a different part of the hospital. This is a whole systems change, and this is about everybody having these core skills. So every week we have training and supervision for our inpatient staff so they can feel more comfortable and confident in using these skills and then supporting the service users to use them too. So then alongside delivering skills in planned sessions, staff are also using them to support de-escalation of incidents and high distress on the ward. Okay. Sorry, I seem to be having some issues with the clicker. There we go. So we've got here's a photograph, which is an example of some objects that people might find safe or soothing. So they're objects that you might carry around with you. You might keep them somewhere in your home where you can easily access them, and you use them to help you feel calm, to soothe you, and to regulate you in times of distress. So they tend to either draw on the senses, but they might also be linked to a positive memory or a positive person. And examples might include a soothing sweet of a particular flavour you find particularly comforting, a really nice smelling perfume that might remind you of someone important to you, a photograph of a loved one. So I've got here, this is my grandmother's wedding ring, who is a really special person to me, and you've probably noticed whilst I'm talking, because I'm a little bit anxious, that I'm fiddling with it quite a lot, and it just helps to sort of ground me and slow me down. So what we're going to do, just to sort of break it up a little bit, is we're going to do a little exercise together. I just want to lay out, if anyone doesn't want to do this, if anyone doesn't feel comfortable, if anyone doesn't feel safe, that's fine. Just engage with whatever feels manageable to you. So what I'd like everyone to do, and again, if you feel comfortable to, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. If you don't feel comfortable to, that's fine as well. Just find a fixed space in the room to have a look at or focus your attention. And I'm just going to give everybody a minute, I guess, to have a bit of a think about what a safe or soothing object might be that's meaningful to you. And as you're thinking about it, I just want you to really take a moment to visualize it and imagine yourself holding it, imagine yourself with this object. Really thinking about what it looks like, what it feels like. Okay, and as you're visualizing this object, I want you just to notice and pay attention to how it makes you feel. Do you notice any changes in the muscles of your face? What's going on in your body? What's running through your mind? And then when you're ready, I'm just going to ask you very slowly just to open your eyes, wiggle your toes, just bring yourself back into the room, just reorient yourself back to where we are. Do you think we've got time to do a little bit of feedback? Yeah? Okay. So I wonder, does anyone feel brave enough maybe to tell us a little bit about what their object might have been, what came to mind? I've got a hand up here.
Thank you. So I often use this for grounding as well. It's a gemstone with the rose quartz, and I've got it's like the softer version. So I keep that on my desk, and I use that very often. And if I know I'm going somewhere where I'm a little bit anxious already, I keep it in my pocket, and I use it when I present or at events. So that's something I use.
It's a really lovely example. Thank you for sharing. Would anybody else like to share?
Yeah, so I wouldn't call it an object, it's my cat. So when he is on my knees, it's really just patting and so on. So it's really comforting, and yeah, my face relaxed, and there was a smile and just relaxation.
So I can definitely connect with that one as someone who's just got 2 kittens, and I've been spending a lot of the conference flicking through photos of them when I think ahead to this presentation. Does anybody else want to share before we move on? Okay, so that means I'm going to hand over to Lucy.
It's me, is it?
Do you want the clicker?
Right, so I've got 2 seconds now. This is just to remind you of the core power threat meaning framework questions. I'm assuming most of you were in the talk earlier when I did a very brief whiz-through of the power threat meaning framework. So the power threat meaning framework is an addition to the trauma-informed practice on the wards that Faye has just described. And the power threat meaning framework suggests some core questions. These are the core questions which can be used to frame a narrative about the reasons of someone's distress instead of a diagnosis. And we're actually going to try that out very shortly. So why not just have trauma-informed practice? Why have power threat meaning framework as an additional approach? And now I'm trying to find my relevant slides. Here they are. Okay, so the power threat meaning framework does draw quite heavily on trauma-informed practice. It's a very compatible approach. A lot of the evidence we looked at was the evidence that comes from trauma-informed practice, the ACE studies, and so on. We think there's always a danger of forgetting the wider context and just talking about traumas as though they're individual things that happen just to one person. So the framework is quite a good way of making sure that the wider context is not forgotten. So the wider context of, let's say, poverty or racial discrimination, or particularly relevant at the moment in this part of the world, war, unstable housing and so on. If we forget the wider context, then we tend to kind of be thinking more as though the problem is an individual person who can't cope rather than a person who's coping as well as they possibly can in difficult circumstances. And the framework also helps us to understand why people may experience distress even if they haven't experienced obvious traumas. I mean, there's shocking figures about abuse, but not everyone who ends up in psychiatric care has been sexually abused or hurt in some other way. As we described earlier, there are all sorts of subtle messages around, which I think are getting worse, about who we should be, how we should look, what kind of lifestyle we should have, what kind of clothes we should wear, how our bodies should look, what kind of diet we should be on. Social media really hasn't helped with this. We live in a very competitive society with a lot of very real stresses around. There's plenty to make us distressed, even if we're lucky enough to have safe and comfortable lives, and the framework helps us to understand that. And the framework, as I said, offers a particular way of structuring a narrative. There are other ways of doing it, but this way actually seems to be found to be quite useful by a number of teams and services. So how do we use the framework narrative in services? This is one way of using it. It's not the only way. As I said, the framework isn't about saying do it this way or do it that way. But we talked earlier about formulation, which is a very common practice in the UK, which is about sitting down together with someone to construct a narrative or a story about their distress. So instead of a diagnosis, you end up with, let's say, a few paragraphs about this happened to you and this is how it felt and this is how you've tried to cope with it and survive it. Now, there's a version of formulation in the UK, which is also quite widely used, which is called team formulation. So it's the same process, But instead of a one-to-one process, it's a process of the members of a team, everyone who knows a particular person who might be being treated by that team or who might be on an inpatient ward, gets together and tries to come up with a shared understanding of that person's distress. So team formulation ideally happens once a week. It's usually facilitated by a couple of people who don't have to be psychologists, could be anyone. And there's been a reasonable amount of research on it showing that it tends to improve teamwork. Everyone's working in the same direction. Everyone has a shared understanding. Everyone knows why we're doing what we're doing. Everybody is signed up to the same plan. So there are all sorts of ways of doing this. So some team formulation practice includes the service user in the room. If they're up for it, of course, they may not want to do that. Some team formulation is seen a bit more like a form of supervision or consultation, which is the model we're going to describe here. Obviously, if you're doing supervision, you wouldn't have the person who's being discussed in the room. But in my experience, it's very necessary for teams to have supervision because otherwise they will continue to do different things in different ways and continue to be probably working in quite diagnostically based ways. So it seems to me that team formulation can work pretty well if the whole team has moved away from diagnostic models, and in that case, a service user might well want to be present or they might choose to be present. Of course, there's always going to be the situation where they're not well enough to attend or they might not want to attend, but the team still needs to have a theory. It's a very tentative theory. We don't know if it's right until we try it out and we discuss it with the service user. So the danger of inviting a service user who's being discussed into the room when the team is still very medically thinking is you don't get a shared narrative, you get someone being sat down and told you have schizophrenia and you need to take more drugs. So essentially what I'm saying is we need to involve service users in whatever way we can, but that is going to vary. And in the trust where Faye works, we actually have peer support workers who help to run team formulation meetings, appropriately supported. They are very much involved in the whole project. And we adhere to guidelines about when are the right circumstances under which it may be helpful to have someone actually present in the room. Okay, this is your slide, I think, Faye, isn't it?
So Lucy's done a bit of an introduction, but what I'm going to do now, I guess, is talk in a bit more detail about the second core trauma-informed practice that we've introduced on our wards, and this is team formulation that's been informed by the Power Threat Meaning Framework. So what I would say is this space has been our biggest vehicle to change in terms of starting to shift staff perception and starting to sort of move our service to a more trauma-informed system that is more acknowledging the relationship between people's experiences and their current difficulties. So Lucy's already given a little bit of an introduction to what team formulation is, so I'm not going to go back over that again, but just to give you a bit of an overview of some of the key points about our approach, and then I'm going to take you through a bit about what it looks like, and then we're going to try it out. So we hold the meeting every week for 1 hour. I think we all acknowledge that an hour is not enough. 90 minutes would be much preferred practice, but unfortunately, that's just not been possible within the constraints of our ward. So the meeting is facilitated by 2 senior members of staff from our multidisciplinary facilitation team. So on our facilitation team, we've got me from psychology, we've got one of our directors, we've got our lead OT, we've got a psychiatrist, we've got our matron. We've also, in some of the other boroughs, we've trained up some of our senior peer support workers and lived experience leads. So our facilitators take responsibility for holding the space and making sure that the meeting happens on time as planned every week. And this is so important because we're trying really hard to provide some contrast to the reactivity of the fast-paced nature of the ward, which often cannot be so conducive to thinking. So different people attend the meeting every week, and different people have different levels of understanding of the framework and the team formulation process, which means we often have to do a little bit of teaching as we're going along. And I think the other thing that was really important for us was that formulation wasn't seen as something that was owned by psychology. Again, this is something that the whole team can think about. And again, this is reflected in the MDT nature of our facilitation team, but also the people that are attending the meeting every week. So every week we have psychiatry, psychology, peer support workers, nursing, occupational therapy. We have administrators who felt so important because they answer the phones and are talking to people. We've got our fitness instructor, and everyone comes from slightly different perspectives, and that's what makes this so helpful. So the focus is all about developing a shared and trauma-informed understanding, and it's this understanding that forms the basis for the way forward. And in terms of the actual structure and the principles, we draw a lot on the ideas that Lucy talks about in her writing on team formulation, and I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail on the next slide. Okay. So this is how our meeting actually looks like in practice, and you'll see on the left we've got an image of how we actually write it up as we're going along. So the meeting always starts with the facilitators introducing staff and explaining just the format of the meeting, and then a member of the team will present a summary of the service user's background and history that we base on a simple template. So we always go and speak to the service user before the meeting. We let them know that we want to come together and think about them as a team, and we get their consent to do that, and we ask them actually what feels really important to be thought about, what would you like to be discussed at the meeting. So after we've talked through that, we spend a bit of time to prompt on how staff might be feeling in response to the service user. And I think this has felt really, really important because we know when we're working with very high levels of distress, staff can often cut off and avoid how they're feeling. And actually that can lead to all sorts of difficulties and all sorts of things being played out without thinking it through. So as a facilitation team, we really try hard to model that it's okay to be in touch with and name even more difficult feelings that might come up, such as feeling frightened or feeling hopeless, as long as we're taking ownership. These are our feelings. No one is making us feel this way. We then move on to sort of getting some questions from the team about where they might be feeling stuck with and why we want to think about this person today. And this question of stuck was really important because this purposely positions the problem with the team. And we're therefore focusing on the team rather than the service user as the problem, and the team as sort of thinking about involved in that movement for change. And then we work through each of the core questions of the framework in turn. So we always start by sharing information about the service user's strengths and resources. So this is the power resources part. And I think this is really important because it starts the development of a different and more hopeful story about the person right from the very beginning. It's starting to connect the team with a more holistic picture of this person behind the diagnoses, behind the medical labels, and it helps to avoid problem-saturated narratives that we can often get stuck with in mental health services. Next, we move on to thinking about this idea of power imbalance. So we spend some time reflecting on experiences of trauma and adversity that might arise in the context of power imbalance. So for example, racial discrimination, sexual abuse. And we try and think about imbalance at multiple levels. So we'll think about individual experiences, family experiences, societal experiences, structural experiences. And we also try really hard as a facilitation team to emphasize where there might have been repeated patterns. So for example, repeated patterns of loss that might have happened throughout someone's life. So I think something that's been really helpful for our team, that as well as supporting staff to really reflect on the range of things and adverse experiences that people might have faced throughout their life, the concept of power has safely, as a staff team, allowed us to reflect on the negative impact of imbalance that actually is perpetuated by our own mental health system. So for example, how being on the ward under section, or how having experiences of being restrained might replicate other frightening and unsafe times in a service user's life where they lacked power and control, and actually how our services have the potential to re-traumatize and what we need to do to prevent that. So next we move on to threat, and we try and think about the different ways that power might threaten the service user. And I think what we found really striking in our setting is this acknowledgement actually that every single person that we've spoken about has experienced often repeated, prolonged, and really, really severe threats to safety. And again, I think this has been really profound for our staff team to reflect on, particularly I would say in relation to many of us male service users with so-called psychosis. And it sort of supported this shift away from perhaps previous understandings where we might be thinking about these service users as agitated or angry in the context of psychosis or illness, and actually towards people as feeling frightened or aroused in the context of past experiences of trauma or unsafety. And I think it's this part of the formulation that's really had a big impact on how our staff are responding to incidents of aggression on the ward. And I'm going to touch on that in a slide in a bit later about our evaluation, but I'm just going to touch on someone that we worked with on our ward who has given consent for me to share a bit of his story today. But I guess an example that comes to mind was we had this young man who was being very aggressive on the ward. It was his first admission, and he'd actually been referred to our psychiatric intensive care unit. So this is called PQ, or it's like a higher secure unit. And we thought about him in team formulation. And actually, we really thought about this anger and this aggression, perhaps as coming from a place of fear and terror in the context of repeated experiences of trauma, including a lot of gang involvement. And this really supported the staff to think about this man differently, and actually how from that framework we might support him in times of distress. And staff went up and posed this to him, and what he came back with, that seems a bit unusual, was that when he was feeling really overwhelmed, one of the other service users had this giant teddy bear. It was like this big, and he said, actually, I would like you to bring me that. And that's what we did. But we would never, ever have come up with an example like that if we'd just thought about this as a biological symptom of psychosis. But actually, this was something that he found soothing. And we sort of joke now that we kept him out of PQ with a teddy bear. So I think if we start to think about things a bit differently, we can try and approach the problems a little bit differently and come up with all sorts of creative solutions. So the next bit is this idea of meaning. So we spend some time reflecting on how the service user might have made sense of their experiences. So basing this both on what the service user has explicitly said to us, as well as very tentative generating by the MDT. So by the team. So we try really hard to make very explicit links between power and threat to make sure that we never decontextualize meaning. So, for example, making links between someone who might have delusional beliefs about other people as dangerous and their past experiences of abuse or unsafety. And we think about how this then supports the team to move away from less helpful understandings of paranoia as just merely a symptom of psychosis or delusions as meaningless, which we know that they're not. And finally, we move on to threat responses and we reformulate symptoms as threat responses. So we support the team to make really explicit links between someone's experiences of adversity, resulting threats, hypothesized meanings, and what's going on at the moment. So for example, perhaps making a link between someone who's been very unsafe, potential beliefs about someone as dangerous, and a threat response of being aggressive or attacking others, which might then actually result in further threats to that individual's safety, and how that cycle goes round. We also try really hard to identify any parallel processes that might play out on the ward. So for example, reflecting on how a service user who might have been bullied or ignored as a child, staff might find that they're giving them less attention and why that's happening, to make sure that we don't play into unhelpful patterns and recreate unhelpful experiences. So in order to end the meeting, we touch back on our feelings as a staff team. And we just reflect on the feelings that were generated at the start, and we also touch in on how we're feeling now. And I guess what we've acknowledged often is how having a better understanding can really shift the way staff are feeling in terms of having more feelings of empathy and hope and a bit of a sense of the way forwards. Okay. So, I think we're doing okay. So I'm just going to whiz through some of our outcomes and evaluation, and then we're going to try it out in practice. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of our outcomes, and then I'll go through each of the findings in a bit more detail. But over the last 4 years, since we've introduced the 2 core practices, which have been stabilization and the team formulation, some of our key findings are as follows. So first, we've noticed a really big change in relation to self-harm. So we've had incidents of self-harm reducing by over 90% on our wards over the last 4 years. Similarly, we've also noticed changes in our use of restrictive interventions. So we've had statistically significant reductions in both our use of seclusion and restraint across the 2 wards. And in line with this, when we looked back over our clinical notes, we found evidence of a 40% increase of staff using verbal de-escalation and skills to try and respond to people in distress rather than going straight in for more restrictive interventions. We also spent a lot of time speaking to staff and service users, and some of the key themes that came out for staff was around having an increased understanding, feeling increased levels of compassion, and also feeling more skilled up. And with service users, we specifically spoke with service users who'd had admissions both prior and post the changes, and they spoke about feeling that their histories were now being taken more into account, about feeling that they had an increased understanding of the relationship between what had happened and how they were feeling now, and also that they felt they'd learnt skills that were being helpful in helping them move forwards. So, okay. So this chart shows our restrictive interventions. On my screen I've got in front of me here, you can't really see the first bar, but the first bar should be in light blue. I hope it's showing up for you. So the first bar is the year prior to the changes, and the subsequent 4 bars are the 4 years post. So as you can see, there's been a significant reduction overall, with the exception of year 3, where we've had another bounce has come up. And this was unfortunately the year of COVID. And when we looked at our data, we saw that we had a 245% increase in staff sickness over that period. So we were using agency staff, bank staff, or had staff shortages. We had a lot of staff on the ward who weren't being trained and using our new model. But despite this, when you look at the data overall, even with this year included, we've had 20% reduction in restraint and 30% reduction in seclusion. And when you take this year out, we've had a reduction of 30% in restraint and over 40% in our use of seclusion. Okay, so this table here, this goes over our self-harm data in a bit more detail. And again, the column on the left in the light blue, this is the year prior to the changes. And the 4 columns afterwards, those are the 4 years afterwards. And again, as you can see, it's sort of self-explanatory, but there's been a really reducing trend in incidents of self-harm following the introduction of our trauma-informed practice. And when we sort of analyse this and run the stats, we can see that it's reduced by over 90%, and also that it was statistically significant. Okay. So I'm not going to talk through all of these in a lot of detail, but just to give a little bit of a summary of some of the outcomes. So we spoke to staff about their experiences of some of the changes on the wards, and these were some of the key themes. So one of the themes that staff spoke about was an increased understanding of the relationship between trauma and distress. So this first quote here says, "This framework, the Power Threat Meaning Framework, has helped us to understand our patients as individuals and address what's behind the diagnosis, not the diagnosis itself." People talk about having a better understanding of what's happened to the person. And also this final quote, which I think is very interesting and probably quite linked to how our staff are now responding in terms of de-escalation and restraints. Maybe this aggression or intimidation comes from a place of fear through trauma. So the second theme was around staff feeling increased levels of compassion for service users. So again, I'm not going to read the quotes out, but they spoke about feeling that they hadn't previously really acknowledged how much someone had been through and what had gone on in someone's life before. And actually how when we have a better understanding, it feels a lot easier to connect with and to work with that person. And also why we're doing the job. And the final theme here that I'm going to present in relation to the staff interviews, this was staff speaking about actually how having a better understanding was supporting them to respond to and de-escalate incidents of distress on the ward. So this staff member said, "It helped me to understand more. Rather than thinking, oh, this person is getting angry, what are we going to do? We need to talk about it, ask what's happening, why do you feel this way? And then we can use different strategies when we understand." So we also spoke with lots of our service users, and specifically we tried very hard to speak to service users who'd had experiences on our inpatient wards, both prior to as well as following the changes. So this is a quote that someone said, that "I think trauma-informed approaches makes a real difference on our ward. For the first time in a very long time, it's given me purpose and hope." So this was one of the first themes. So service users spoke about feeling that their history was now being more taken into account. So the second person here has said, "My history was taken into account by the team. It helped me to come to terms with the death of my father. Staff asked me about it. They asked the right questions. Hospital and talking helped me to come through the other side." So this is the second theme, and this is relating to people speaking about actually having a better understanding themselves of the links between what has happened and what's going on now, that being helpful in supporting people to move forwards. So the second person here said it helped me to understand what it was going on for me, to understand what I was going through and how to manage it in case it comes back. And the final theme, this is more linking to our manual and the stabilisation skills, which I probably should have said as a little plug, are all freely accessible for anyone to download and have a use if you'd like to, and I will share that link at the end. But this theme is around service users feeling that they'd learnt more skills and they were supporting them to feel safer inside and better able to cope. So this first person has said, I learnt a lot about self-compassion and being kind to myself. Okay. So this is the final slide before we get a little bit more interactive and hopefully get a bit of energy up at the end of the day. But just to finish off, I guess our project, it started by introducing 2 core trauma-informed practices, which were the Power Threat Meaning Framework team formulation and also the stabilisation interventions on our 2 inpatient psychiatric wards in Harrow, which is a borough of London. And within this borough, we are now offering these practices as well to our home treatment and crisis resolution team, to our psychiatric liaison team who support accident and emergency in the physical health wards, and we've also run a pilot with our community mental health teams. And in terms of wider, from 2019, we extended this project to the 13 other psychiatric wards in our mental health trust across London, and they're all now running formulation using this model and using the interventions at various stages of development. And we're also working on developing the project further with our perinatal teams and also our complex emotional needs teams. Okay. So I think that's it.
Take a couple of questions, just while
Yeah.
I alert the girls to get the handouts.
Yeah?
Yeah, take a couple of
Okay.
questions.
All right.
Move on.
So while we're just getting set up for the next part, do we have any questions or comments?
Are you asking a question?
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. My question is about the reduction of physical restraints measures in the acute psychiatric ward.
Yeah.
In your slide, there was a 20% reduction during which period? During 4 years?
So overall, there was a 20% reduction, but when we took that year 3 out, which was the year with COVID, it went up to 30% for the restraint, and the seclusion overall for the first year compared with the 4 years was 30%, and when we took that 3rd year out, when we had the agency staff, that went up to 40%.
What would be your interpretation? Is it a good result or is it not enough?
I think it's not enough, absolutely not enough. I think definitely we want to keep moving forwards, and I would say we've taken small steps, but there's a lot more to be done, yeah.
Hi, I'm not desperate, but it's a very brief question indeed. So just wondering, I read this book by, I think she's called Judith Herman, and it's called Trauma and Recovery. Exactly. And I think she also talks about 3 phases of recovery. Are they the same as in your model?
It's the same.
Yeah. Okay.
That's where the 3-stage comes from. It's a very, very good book, Trauma and Recovery. I'll answer that question for you. So fantastic, thank you, Faye. So now we come to the most exciting bit of the workshop. You will need 2 things. First of all, this is not essential, but we've been giving out, and I think you may have grabbed on the way in, but if you didn't, we have some spare copies, a thing called a quality measure. So this is the structure that we've developed, or rather Faye and her team have developed, in order to do a team formulation meeting. It kind of reminds you which questions to ask and remember to have a plan at the end and all that kind of stuff. So if anyone wants a copy, has anybody, we have it in 3 languages. Does anybody want a copy that hasn't got a copy? Yep. And here's another one. And this you will need. This is a brief description of someone called John. And we have this in 3 languages. So if anyone doesn't have a brief description of John in a language that's understandable to you, please grab one. We need the team formulation slide up here. Okay, hope everybody's equipped with John at least, and with the other one if you want. I think it's after that. No, I was wrong. That's it? No, it's that one. Okay. This is what we're now going to try a flavour of. We're going to give you a very brief flavour of team formulation meeting. In a minute, not just yet, we have 5 very kind people that we've grabbed at various points throughout the previous 2 days and said, please, please come and do a role play. So we have 5 people who are going to come up and they're going to sit on these chairs and pretend to be members of staff or peer support workers, because they also attend these meetings, whatever you want. And we're going to do a bit of the meeting. Now, Faye described it. That's what it looks like. In total, it usually takes an hour. Because we haven't really got an hour, we're going to start a bit of way in. We're going to start with the power resources, power imbalances, and so on. So we're going to assume that we've done the first bit of the meeting, and the first bit of the meeting includes everybody reading about the background of the person we're going to discuss. So we've invented someone called John. This is not a real person, but he's perhaps typical of some people who might be receiving psychiatric care. We're imagining he arrived on the ward 3 days ago. We're imagining the staff feel quite stuck and don't know really understand his problems and don't really know how they can help him. So I'll just read this out, and you can read your own copy so we all know who John is. John is a white man in his 40s. He has a daughter by a previous relationship. He is currently off work, having hurt his back in a car accident, and he's not sure whether he'll ever be able to play football again, which is one of his main hobbies. His relationship ended last year when his partner had an affair and he lives on his own. John's family didn't have much money when he was growing up, and he says his father was frequently violent to his mother. John has 2 younger sisters and is close to one of them, but she was recently diagnosed with cancer. He won a scholarship, a free place, in other words, to a good school, but he was bullied because he was seen as being different from the other pupils who came from wealthier backgrounds, and he did badly in his school exams. When his mother died last year, John became very low in mood and struggled to cope. He had thoughts of suicide. John's family doctor diagnosed clinical depression and started him on medication. However, this has not helped. He was recently admitted to the ward. He has been neglecting himself in his flat, and he reported he's afraid to leave the house because the neighbours are plotting against him and are planning to report him to the police. Although he lives in a deprived part of town, there appears to be no truth to these rumours. On the ward, John has become increasingly isolated and so far very reluctant to engage with the ward staff. Occasionally he has angry outbursts and he's broken some crockery. This appears to be triggered by male staff trying to encourage him in his personal hygiene. At other times he appears hopeless and frightened. Many aspects of his history are still unclear as he is very distrustful of staff. Okay, so this is John. As sometimes happens when the staff feel stuck, they're searching around desperately for another diagnosis. So the staff question is, perhaps he has psychosis, and we're going to try to create perhaps a different understanding of that. And we're going to do that with the help of our 5 role players. Would you like to come to the stage, take your place? This is very kind of you. Do you want that there, or is that okay for you there? Sorry, need to pull this over this side. And if you can't see very well, do feel free to move to the front. There's plenty of chairs, or to stand up, or to shuffle your chair around. I'll sit here. Okay, so here we have, I'm going to pretend to be a member of staff as well. Let's assume we have mainly staff and 1 or 2 peer workers, and we've just all agreed that this is John's history. We all know John a little bit. None of us know him very well. We've talked a bit about how we all feel quite stuck and frustrated. And our initial question is, does John have psychosis? So we'll join the meeting at that point, and Faye is leading the meeting.
Okay. So we've spent a bit of time already just talking through John's background and history, and these are the things that he's shared with us and knows we're going to be talking about at the meeting. He knows that we're coming here today and that we really wanted to come together and think about him because we really care about him and want to think about how we can best move forwards. We've had a bit of a touch-in on our feelings, and I understand the main question, the main reason that staff wanted to bring John today, to think about him, was this question around, does John have psychosis? So we're going to move on to our formulation here. I know we've got a few new members in the team, so what I'm going to do as we talk through each of the parts of the formulation, I'm just going to give a little bit of a description for anyone that's new to the meeting. So the first thing we always start with is power resources, which I think can often get missed when we're working within these settings. So this is really thinking about John's strengths, about his resources. So what do people think we could put in this box here?
Yeah, just speak. And sorry, we're sharing microphones. Sorry, I should have given that out. We're sharing microphones. Just speak.
Present who we are?
No, I think just carry on.
Well, we know that John got a scholarship at some point. That's a clear resource. And he has quite a few people that he's connected to. He has a sister, even though she's sick, and he has a daughter, even though we don't know that much about her.
Yes.
So I definitely see that as resources.
So remind me as well, this scholarship, this was for school, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, it was.
This was good school, okay.
He's obviously an intelligent guy, isn't he?
Yeah, he must be. He
Yeah.
must be.
Yeah.
Definitely. And we've said around the relationships, you've spoken about sister and also daughter, although we need to find potentially a bit more out about that. Okay, thank you.
Also, he's a white man in the UK, which is definitely a power resource.
Yeah, and put that down. Okay.
Maybe normally he has some physical abilities. He plays football, even though the car accident, of course, it's a different. We talk about that later, I assume.
Yeah, potentially we've got some things, haven't we, that might sort of be bridging across these first two boxes.
But there could be some resources in the football team.
Yeah,
Because he's playing with other people. I
Team
guess.
player. It's a team player.
Yeah, teammates
Definitely,
or
okay.
some kind of network.
so we've got a few things in relation to the football that are potentially resources.
Also a huge network of people that he's in a relation with, so not only daughter and not only family.
Yes, absolutely. So potentially there's the relationships coming from football, his interest within that and the hobby. Okay. What else have we got?
He had a job till recently.
And remind me, Lucy, what was it that John was doing?
He was a supervisor at a local factory, and it sounds like he was liked and respected at his job.
Okay.
Do we know if he owns his own flat?
I'm not sure, actually. It's something that we should find out more about. Maybe I'll put it down with a little bit of a question mark. Do we know anything from what John's told us here about his housing situation?
So he was not doing very well by himself alone at home.
Okay.
So we do know that, but we don't know
Okay.
if he needs to pay rent or if he owns his own place, which could be.
But potentially that could be a resource that we want to find out a little bit more about, that he's got some housing.
And that he lives in a deprived part of town. You know that.
So that, I think we're going to put a pin on it and hold on to, actually. But don't forget that. I think that's really going to be very important for us to think a little bit more about. What else have we got in terms of resources, do people think? Are there any things that, or even when we spent time with John, things he might have said to us, the way we've sort of been with us?
I think he really wants to be helped. You can see he's trying to kind of work out what to do, but I think he just feels very stuck.
Okay.
So
Maybe he wasn't really coping that bad. I mean, taking under consideration how many things has happened during a short period of time. It looks really, it's good that he's here, and I think it also tells me that he is actually coping
Yeah.
to some extent.
Absolutely. I mean, he's surviving through some really, really difficult experiences recently, hasn't he? Just going to put down that he's a survivor. Okay. Anything else in terms of resources before we move on? It's amazing, isn't it, that actually I think John's only been with us for 3 days and we've quite easily managed to fill up that box with quite a lot of information about him, but potentially there's also some gaps that we might want to think a bit more about. Okay. So what we're going to do next is we're going to move on to thinking a little bit about imbalance or power imbalance. So these are the experiences or the things affecting John where he might have been left feeling powerless or out of control, and some of the experiences that might have come from that. So what are the things that feel really important for us to think about that might be affecting John at the moment?
But definitely this back, which is hurt. And
I need to put that.
I'm sorry. It's definitely the accident, probably. The most recent threat is this physical incapability, probably, to move simply. Yeah.
And that feels so important, doesn't it? Because it actually seems to link to quite a lot of the things here that we put as resources. So something around sort of his masculinity, what it means to be a man, to be powerful, to be strong, potentially linked to his football. These things potentially seem to be taking away from that. Will you just remind me with the accident? Do we know, was that recently that he's hurt his back? It's just that he's currently at work.
Currently off work.
Yeah, I think it was a couple of months ago.
Okay.
So, and it doesn't seem to be getting better, so I think that's been extra frustrating for him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What else have we got that would be really important?
Maybe that he's from an economically disadvantaged background. I think as such, maybe that's not necessarily a power imbalance, but maybe his experience at school, that other pupils made clear that he was kind of excluded from the main group. And then maybe also his loss of work currently adds to that. I think these three things together kind of, can make him feel powerless in a way.
Definitely. I mean, it's a really big thing, isn't it? Potentially living in poverty as a power imbalance. And we know 2 ways that this has been playing out in his life, like you said, with school and work. And I wonder what other ways it might have affected him as well. We've also touched as well potentially on housing. Is that stable? Is that not? And how that might be being influenced.
Also, this relationship with her, one of the sisters, which seems important, at least from this what we know. And now I guess he is either afraid of, making even more stress on her sister, sharing any of his problems. So it's in this interpersonal dimension, it's probably also a huge threat.
Definitely. And she was someone right at the beginning, wasn't it, that we spoke about as really important in terms of resource, but is actually very unwell at the moment.
Maybe she's worried he's going to die. I mean, his mum died not that long ago, didn't she? Yes. And I don't know, I wonder if he's even got over that. We don't know how close he was to his mum, but that must have been a big shock, mustn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Again, was that recently, the death of his mother, do we know? It was
Died last year.
Yeah. So there's been a lot, hasn't there, happened actually for John in quite a short period of time?
Yeah, but still, when it comes to this history of the families, this father who has been frequently violent to his mother, so maybe somehow, it's on a deeper level, this is all still very a living situation inside him, maybe he didn't cope with this, he couldn't maybe help. In cancer situation, he cannot help either, so maybe this is just triggering this anxiety and...
Yeah. Absolutely. And I wonder what that was like for John growing up in that potentially, well, not potentially, very real, very frightening environment with the domestic violence between his parents.
Oh, so maybe he feels abandoned, though I don't know if that would be a threat.
Yeah.
Because we don't really know if his daughter's helping or not.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe even abandoned by society, so to speak. He's lost his job, he can't play football anymore. The sense of isolation must be really strong.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to put a pin in the feelings of feeling abandoned and isolated. Hold on to them because they feel really important. But there was something you touched on just here around society. Say again what you just said, sorry. You said around having he's lost his job and also not being able to play
Yeah,
football
kind of the
anymore.
unfair society, being abandoned by society in a way.
He's actually suffered some kind of class discrimination, hasn't he? So he's white, he's male, that brings some advantages, but he's been bullied for, at his school, not coming from a wealthy background. So, you know, I guess that's probably not left him feeling too good about himself.
Yes. Well, I was thinking as well that potentially he's also falling into a lot of categories now that within society are perceived as very negatively. So he's not working, he's from a lower social economic class, he's got some physical health difficulties, and now potentially also he's fulfilling the role of being a mental health patient, another group that we know is very stigmatized, another label.
I'm actually quite worried about that he feels powerless in here.
Yes.
He's isolated, not really doing anything, not talking to anyone. It worries me that he feels powerless now in here.
And actually, we know he doesn't want to be in here. I understand he's been brought in under section, and he's been quite explicit that he doesn't want to be here on the wards.
Goodness. It might feel a bit like being back at school, mightn't it? You know, but anyway.
It's also, you know, maybe that's an important issue of him not taking really care of his personal hygiene, that he's somehow trying to say, just get off, you know, keep away as far as you can. I don't want you here. It's interesting.
Absolutely.
Why such a man is, you know, is to be instructed on a basic thing, right?
And please hold on to that. Don't forget that, because I think that's going to be really important when we start to think about here. I'm going to put a pin in it just for a minute. I know you were about to say something. Sorry, Matty. I
Yeah,
keep
also
missing you.
his partner left him. And I think also maybe in a breach of trust, because she had an affair with another person apparently. So maybe a person he thought I can count on her, and it turned out to be otherwise. So.
Definitely. And also, again, potentially really challenging this idea around masculinity. And I wonder what the impact might have been. Okay. So we've actually got a lot of things in this box and a lot of things that we've thought about already. I wonder, is there anything else before we start to move on that feels really important that we should put down there about John?
Just makes me think what a really bad time he's been through, doesn't it? When you think about it, he's had a terrible time, hasn't he? He's had a really difficult time, and then the car accident on top of everything.
Yes.
You know, no wonder he's feeling pretty stuck. But, yeah.
Okay. You look like you're about to say something. I don't want to move on if you had to.
Well, no, it's just this, that he actually, I don't know how he's with other patients, but with the staff, he's not very well. I mean, that's the motive here as well. He doesn't follow, he doesn't want to talk, he's aggressive towards staff people, so it's also interesting.
Yeah, so actually there's something going on with the relationships on the ward, which I think was said by someone earlier, might be replicating some of these earlier experiences at school where he felt quite bullied and excluded. Okay.
And there's not much information about a daughter in the vignette. So is it the case that she didn't visit at all? Did she visit John lately?
Gosh. Yeah, I'm not sure. Does anyone know, has she visited? We don't think so. Okay. So that feels, again, a really important thing to put down here, doesn't it? Okay. All right. So what we're going to do, we're going to move down now to threat. So again, for anyone that's new to the meeting, this is sometimes the way I think this can be helpful to have in your mind is, as human beings, I guess we have a set of absolutely core needs in order to thrive and survive. And when difficult things happen, when we have difficult experiences in our life, these are challenged or threatened. So what do we think the impact of these experiences have been on John? Have they been threatening him? Or what's been threatened?
His physical health is threatened, obviously, isn't it?
He's attacking other people, yeah.
Sorry, I missed what you said.
He's attacking other people, he's aggressive, so that definitely he causes some kind of danger to himself.
Yes.
Although,
So physical health and also his physical safety.
he's here with us, so his independence, maybe he feels managed,
Absolutely.
which is why he might be also acting out.
Yeah. And that independence, it feels potentially has been like challenged multiple times, hasn't it? Both here with us, but also with this loss of job, with the accident, potentially because of economic disadvantage, the things that he hasn't been able to do.
His relationships are threatened. He's facing some loss of relationships, potential loss of relationships,
Yeah.
loss of support.
And again, this feels so significant, doesn't it? We've got thinking about relationships right from early experiences with this domestic violence from his dad. We've got the mother who he's lost recently, the lack of contact with his daughter, his sister's unwell, and now also relationships are breaking down on the ward. Okay.
Yeah, looks like all these solid or stable things that are usually supporting they disappear. It's a very short period of time.
Absolutely. Should we put that down, sort of threat to stability, perhaps?
Yeah, I think a huge shock, definitely. No support, no, nothing that was calming and suiting you before.
I think I would describe it as disconnection
Yeah, so
from job, from friends, from family.
and this was making me think a little bit, because when you said connection first, it was making me think around relationships, but then when you spoke about job, I was also thinking potentially a little bit around like threats to his identity and who he is.
That's true. He must be thinking he's lost his status, or at least at the moment he has. He's lost the things that made him who he is in a way, his football, some of his relationships. Yeah. And he's a mental patient. So that's not a great place to be in, is it?
So this anxiety.
I'm also worried about the stigma that might follow being here, actually. If he's not getting visits because he's worried about telling someone that he's in this system and what this system can mean when you get out again. And so I'm worried about the stigma that might follow.
Absolutely. Shall we pop stigma up here, which potentially is relating to lots of the different groups that we've touched on, and then linking your point with Lucy's potentially thinking about a threat to his sense of self and how, does that feel fair? I'm not sure if anyone can actually read my writing. Sorry, I'm scrawling whilst I'm thinking. Okay. Is there anything else that we've got in terms of threat before we move on that feels really important?
Future is the threat.
Threats to his future?
If there is any, first of all, and what kind of?
Potentially threats to his future aspirations or his hopes for the future?
Just, probably in a situation like this, I would feel myself that I don't really know what to do, you know? So how can you plan anything if there is no basis? Everything is in ruin, actually, or the relationship and all. That's the end of the world as we know it.
Yeah.
Maybe it's somewhere there already, but the financial situation and falling back to an economically disadvantaged position like when he was young.
Yeah.
That's true.
Absolutely. Move on. Sorry. Okay.
A bit of an eye on the time.
I might just very quickly, I was sort of thinking, we've talked about physical safety, but I wonder as well whether we should put emotional safety down there in terms of thinking what it must have been like as a child growing up with the domestic violence. Okay. So the next bit that we're going to move on to is this idea of meaning, so how we might think that John has been making sense of his experiences. So everything we suggest, this is obviously just hypotheses, because we haven't checked these out with John yet, and I know he's told us a little bit some of the things that he's feeling, so we can put that down there. But what should we put in here?
Feels hopeless, I'd guess. Probably feels I'm a failure.
Alone.
Maybe he thinks that we are plotting right now against him.
Yeah, everyone's against me. It would make sense, right, to have a belief like that. You also said something at the beginning that I annoyingly asked you to put a pin in. Can you remember what it was?
Yes, I think it was about this violence against his mother. No. It was about the personal hygiene, right? And
Did you say something before that, maybe around him feeling abandoned?
sorry,
Sorry.
can't recall.
Okay, I'm going to put that down there. I think you
Okay.
did say it. Not to put words in your mouth. Okay. Anything else in terms of meaning or how he might be making sense of his experiences?
Unfulfilled expectations, maybe.
Sounds like he's feeling quite angry because he's lashing out on the ward, isn't he?
I feel like it would be quite understandable for him to be feeling quite angry given everything that's been going
Yeah.
on as well.
I wonder if he had a space to express that anger and maybe build up with time, because if we assume he's British, English maybe, then there aren't that many spaces, culturally speaking, for him to say, I am mad, I want to punch a teddy bear, or a pillow maybe, to express my frustration, right?
Absolutely. And I guess potentially given his early experiences of domestic violence, anger might feel like a very unsafe emotion, mightn't it? One that doesn't feel feels especially uncomfortable.
Yeah, he doesn't want to think he's being like his dad, does he? I guess, possibly. Yeah.
Well, it's just an open question. Maybe somebody else has the answer, but he reacts only aggressively to male staff. And I think that requires explanation. But I don't really have the explanation. Of course, there is his father and maybe his wife being unfaithful, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, really interesting point. And I'm going to ask you to hold on to that for 1 second, because I think maybe we can try and make a bit of sense of that when we move on to threat responses. Before we do that, I wonder, is there anything else in terms of meaning?
Well, I think he might feel trapped physically, you know, for someone who is physically active. Maybe that was the channel that he was actually burning out, this energy, these bad thoughts, and maybe, so maybe he's lacking this very much, and those outbursts of anger might be the result. Maybe.
And he's actually physically trapped here now on the ward, isn't he?
And he might feel quite devaluated, like we're
Say again, sorry.
telling him to do something about his personal hygiene.
Yeah.
That must do something to him, that he doesn't feel like he can't even control the simplest things.
Yeah.
That we are maybe talking down to him. I could understand if he would feel like that.
And again, that might be replicating lots of other experiences where he's felt very devalued or subjugated in relation to other people.
I was recently speaking to another client who had a physical injury, and it can, not being able to move creates a lot of not just frustration, but especially nervousness, anxiety, and lack of patience as well, because physical recovery requires lots of patience to sit with it, right? Especially if you've hurt your back.
Yes.
But many patients do not comply because they're so stressed, like, I can't stand still anymore, like I have to go out there.
Yes. No, absolutely.
And they can injure themselves further because they're not patient enough.
Okay. So I'm a little bit aware of time. Are we needing to move on? Yes, okay. All right, so I'm going to move us down to threat responses. So this is what we might more traditionally be thinking about as our symptoms, but actually what we're going to do today is we're going to reformulate all of these and try and make sense of everything it is that's going on for John in the context of everything we've spoken about. So we've got the first one. I'm going to come back to you, Matty. You were talking about that we've seen John as actually being quite angry and aggressive on the ward, and that's particularly in relation to male, is it just male members of staff, or is it male service users as well?
I think members of staff
I think
only.
it's members of staff mainly, yeah.
How might we make sense of that, given what we know about what's going on and what's happened for John?
Yeah, so there are people who are male and in control, It's, not on eye level, but like his father can control him and say what he should do, because all the other people, either they go away or other people that are there are going to tell him what he should do,
Okay.
bother him more.
So actually men who are in control might be very frightening, given his early experiences with his dad being in control and the violence. Okay. Are there any other ways we might understand some of the aggression? It might be fulfilling sort of several different functions.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe it reminds you of being bullied at school. That might have been by older boys, mightn't it? And I don't think we know anything about that, but that's possible.
Yeah, that's definitely a good idea. Okay.
Or teachers, we just don't know, do we really?
I mean, again, I was thinking a little bit about John's sort of very earliest experiences and whether this is something that he's learnt, that one of the ways to sort of survive, to stay in control and to keep yourself safe is to be angry, perhaps.
Yeah. I'm just thinking right now that maybe this personal hygiene, because this really doesn't fit for me into this man. It's maybe it's saying to some people stay away, but also it's this only person, it's only part where he actually can have control.
Yeah.
So he refuses to do this because that's the only thing that he
yeah.
has control over.
Yeah.
Maybe that's about that as well.
Really good thought. Okay. I wonder about some of these, because there's some unusual ideas, isn't it, that John's been expressing that we've been a bit worried about. What if I got them here? That he thinks the neighbours are plotting against him and planning to report him to the police. Has anyone got any thoughts around those ideas and where they might be coming from?
He obviously feels very unsafe in some way, doesn't he? He's like the world isn't safe, his community isn't safe, so...
People can be nasty to you.
But if we think about his background, he presumably didn't feel very safe at home, and it sounds like he didn't feel very safe at school, so I don't know if that's got anything to do with it, but it perhaps does.
Yes. So perhaps these ideas aren't so unusual or aren't so unordinary in the context of everything that's happened to John or that we know that's happened to John so far. Okay.
Maybe he's also confused about it.
Sorry.
He's also confused about, just the self-understanding of when he's behaving okay and when he's not behaving okay. It's, and this is why he's so much afraid of someone judging him and telling him that he's doing wrong things and so on. So it's, self-awareness a little bit maybe.
Because it feels there's been lots of experiences where he's been positioned as doing the wrong thing, isn't it? Or not quite right or good enough.
Not be sure about himself,
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe he has the feeling that he cannot trust other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, he might be right about that. He's had some experiences which would lead you to feel that, hasn't he?
Absolutely. Okay. I'm a little bit aware of time and we're sort of whizzing to the end of our meeting. Shall we wrap it up there, do we think, in terms of threat responses? Yeah?
Well, we've got a few minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything else then before we move to the next part when we're going to de-roll that anyone would like to add in terms of threat responses on this last bit of the formulation?
Maybe he also withdraws socially from like the peers on the ward.
How do we make sense of this? Why do we think he might be withdrawing?
Because he locks himself up in his room, or he stays in his room. I don't recall exactly. Yeah.
Well, might feel safer for him, mightn't it? Well, if the whole world feels unsafe, and he's not, perhaps doesn't find it very easy to talk to people. No wonder he's hiding himself away.
Potentially it feels like he's flipping between these two possessions of sort of isolating and then being very angry, but both potentially protecting him from a world around him that is very unsafe and has been very unsafe, right?
Getting into any interaction, it's quite difficult, looks like.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So I'm going to take us out of roll and hand over to Lucy. Yeah.
Thank you to our role players. That was brilliant, and not going to let you leave the stage quite yet. Thank you. So perhaps we can open some of this discussion up to the audience as well. How do we hope the staff might be feeling at the end of that? How do we hope the staff might be feeling And we're not looking for miracle changes, but would there be a difference in how you're feeling about John? There's a microphone here if you want to use it.
Am I still in the role? Or in the role,
yes,
I could
kind of
say,
are.
well, first, as a male staff member, of course, I was very annoyed by the behavior of John, and I can check in on him, I can help him, and he also only became aggression back. But now I understand it a little bit better why he does that.
Good. So there's a greater sense of understanding. You might have been a member of staff who was feeling stuck and frustrated, and now you can see where it's coming from. Yeah. Anybody else feel they might be viewing him a bit differently?
Yeah, because we all have different roles within the center.
Yeah.
So, and we work at different times with John, kind of having the perspective in the same place all together of who he might be. I think it's very helpful because it's one person's opinion, but then when we have 5 different people, I think you can actually see him more as a human being, as a person, just like us, not just a client in the center.
We really hope so. He's moved from a kind of person, a mental patient, to, a person, and who's someone who's survived a lot. So we're seeing him very differently. And that slide, every interaction as an intervention, well, we hope that in a way, every tiny interaction from now on with John will just feel a little bit different from him, because you're seeing him as a person, and he will pick that up.
Also, his attacks of angry outbursts. I think for me personally, it's that I feel a little bit more safe about that. That I understand that there is a reason. It's not without reason, so that it was just like this. And I can understand now that there are probably some situations that can lead to this. So it makes me feel a little bit safer. And
That's really helpful. And this isn't a miracle cure, but it sounds like it's really helped to shift people's thoughts and ideas. So if this is what we would usually do at the end of a meeting, go back to the question, does John have psychosis? Does it make sense to say, oh, well, this is all because he's psychotic, or do we have a different and perhaps a more convincing explanation? What do you think? You have a better explanation than that?
Yeah, I actually don't think the question makes sense.
It doesn't, well, no.
To discuss this category, because he has a lot of reasons for being angry and afraid, and
Exactly. Exactly.
But I also think that we are making a lot of assumptions. We need to talk a lot more to John, and I hope that he will join us the next time.
Very much want to come back to that, thank you. But yes, it's interesting how this question doesn't even make sense anymore, does it? And actually, if we did have a much briefer standard psychiatric meeting and say, I think we need to tell John that he's having a psychotic breakdown, this tells us that wouldn't be received very well by John. Oh dear, I'm getting worse, I'm even more of a failure, I'm even more stuck. So we've moved away from that. I want to come back to that point, because let's just think very, very quickly about ways forward. I mean, just for a couple of minutes. So what ways forward does this, the point of doing this is to think of a different way forward. And it doesn't have to be big fancy things. It's partly in terms of just our everyday interactions with John are going to be a bit different. We're a bit more interested in him as a person. We need to be very careful about assumptions, but there are things we've come up with which might lead us to think, well, it'd be really good for someone to sit down with John and chat to him about this. What else might we suggest as a way forward?
I was just thinking, maybe we can think of, is it possible, in general, I don't know, to engage some of other patients to get to know more, like maybe he's behaving different way with them. It's only us, that pose a kind of threat to him.
I would also contact John's daughter. Maybe she wants to come by and.
So 2 things. They're not big fancy things, but they could be very important things for him. I'm going to take 2 things that we would nearly always recommend. One is, we have this stabilisation manual on the ward. So somebody who knows John is going to sit down with him, is going to talk to him about how he feels when he starts feeling aggressive, how he feels when he starts getting these scary thoughts about the neighbours are plotting with him. We're going to help him develop some strategies to deal with those feelings, aren't we? And that could be very helpful to him. And the second thing we need to discuss in the meeting is, how should we feed this back to John? Because one thing I always say is this is our story about his story. We don't know if this is his story. This is our best guess. And we need to feed it back to him in some way. And it's going to be we don't want to come along and say, look, this is your problem. We're trying to do the opposite of that. We're trying to prepare ourselves to really listen to him. So how might we feed some of this back to him, bearing in mind he's probably not in a state to take in all of this at once, and he probably doesn't want to talk about all these difficult things at the moment. But what could we say that's the start of a helpful conversation with him? Because he knows we're meeting.
Maybe that it's understandable, that his behavior is understandable.
That would be, we hope that would be a reassuring message, not, I'm afraid you're seriously mentally ill, but when we had sat down and had to think about all the things you've been through, we really thought it's not surprising you're feeling so stuck and so scared and so depressed at times.
But maybe just a simple question, what he needs, like very basic thing. Right now what he needs from us, but maybe from other people. Maybe
Indeed.
he will ask for a meeting with someone or something else, whatever.
Ask him. Simple and obvious. Ask him. We can offer some ideas, but we certainly don't want to say, we've decided this is the plan for you. We could say we wondered if this would help, but we need to ask him. Yeah.
Maybe we can also stop focusing on hygiene. I mean,
Yeah.
in whose interest is it that John takes a shower?
That's a really good point. I mean, it's really not working. It's increasing his lack of sense of safety and distrust, isn't it? It's much more important that he trusts us than he has a shower every day because we think he should. So we might just try and drop that one. Good thought.
Is it possible for him to have a little bit, I don't know if he is capable because of his back injury, but maybe there is something he can do physically.
Yeah. Really good point. If there's a physio on the ward, or we can have access to one, it'd be really good to find out, can he do some back exercises? Is there some stuff he can be doing to heal his back? That's true. I'm sure we could go on, and thank you. Now you've slipped back into role again, partly because I started asking all those questions. So I'd like to take you out of role. You're no longer staff or team members, and thank you so much for your contributions. That was absolutely brilliant. And you can leave the meeting. Thank you. So, yeah, go back to, yes.
You stay if you like.
So we've actually got a bit of time that you and I could take some questions, comments, feedback. I'll rush round with the microphone, unless there's a kind person who wants to do that. Oh, that's very kind of her, thank you. That's assuming there are any questions. So, comments, questions, feedback. I hope that gave you a tiny flavour.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really, really great. So in South Africa, I'm a wellness counsellor, which is a designated counselling space, and we do something very similar because it's very wellness orientated. So what I really liked about this approach is that you're looking at all the different domains of wellness in his life. So occupational, his home life and all that sorts of stuff. So for me, what I wanted to ask, would you ask him at the end or when you go back to him, particularly about his anger, do you have a way of expressing your anger that doesn't mean physical, so would a punching bag work? Obviously not in the ward, but how would you approach that? I hope that question makes sense.
That's a good question.
Yeah, so I guess sort of all sorts of different ways. So often we have a bit of a think about where the anger is coming from, and often the formulation is around, either people quite understandably being very angry because very difficult things are happening, but also around this sort of quite high threat response and feeling quite unsafe. So it might even just start with a bit of a conversation around, it seems like things feel quite unsafe for you right now. Is there anything we could be doing that could be supporting you when you're feeling like this? And I guess that was sort of the conversation that started with this other young man with the teddy bear that was a bit random. But we've got a range of different things. We've got fitness instructor, and actually punch bag is something people really like to do in a bit of a planned and proactive way. But I think the thing that's really important is that they're formulation-driven intervention. So it's not this person has this, therefore this is going to work, but it's thinking about what's the understanding, what do they think is going to be helpful, and how, from our hypothesis, do we try and find a helpful way together forwards. Does that sort of answer the question? Yeah. Is there anything you'd add?
No, I think that's
Okay.
absolutely right. Yeah. There's a couple of, there's one person there and one person there.
Hi, this is more of a feedback. I just want to say I've been following the Power-Desired Meaning framework for a while now, but listening to this, I haven't heard of the team formulation thing and this meeting setup call. I have ideas of reference, and even listening to the thoughts and etc. I don't know. It's like helped me in my. It felt like a therapy session, even though it was acted. So that's points to you for making it working, I think.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that because I only speak one language, and that's English. Could anyone translate that for me, or I wasn't.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I think the microphone blurred a little bit. Would you say it again?
Yes.
Oh, I said basically I have ideas of reference. Basically, that means I think that people, general paranoia, so I feel even hearing you talking about some random person, I was thinking that you were talking about me, but it felt like a genuine compassion. So yeah, that's points for the framework that it works.
Thank you very much for that comment. And for sharing a bit about yourself as well. Thank you.
Hi. I am a psychiatrist with lived experience, and I can say that the script that you gave us does not absolutely exclude psychosis. But what I want to say that we have to approach psychotic patients with the same care and with the same interest like non-psychotic patients, because usually the biomedical model approach psychotic patients with medication. They let the patient in his room, sometimes with a closed door, and they are not, at least from the experience that I have, this kind of analysis are not made for psychotic patients, and I think they are very useful even for psychotic patients. Yes, to be for the psychotic patients to be seen as a person, as a human being with values and with needs that are beyond medication, only medication.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the main population of people that are admitted to our wards have been given a diagnosis of psychosis. And when I first started on the wards 4 years ago, I was told really firmly, don't worry, Faye, there's no role for therapies or psychology on an acute ward. You won't have any referrals. So we now have 14 staff from the therapies team sitting across the wards, and everyone from consultant psychiatrist to peer support worker to fitness instructor are all sort of trying to think in this way.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and seeing people as human, I think,
Yes.
isn't it? And people.
Yes. Thank you for that comment. I guess that the power threat meaning framework doesn't see a strict division between people who are said to be psychotic and the rest of us. We all have strange ideas at times. I do. Some of the ideas, I mean, looking at it from the point of view of the power threat meaning framework, they would say some unusual ideas are socially valued, so it's fine. It's fine to believe in God, that's a socially valued idea. It's not fine to believe that, you know, in some cultures, it's not fine to believe that God is constantly talking to you or that angels are talking to you or whatever. We all have unusual beliefs. Some of those beliefs are much more distressing than others, and then people may need some kind of help, but there are nearly always reasons for that. And of course, they're human beings first and foremost. So thank you for that comment. Any other comments or questions?
Hello everyone, my name is Natalia. I'm clinical psychologist from Ukraine. I work in mental hospital and my questions will be next. Thank you very much for your brilliant workshop. And I'm also a Adlerian therapist, and my main statement, never give up on people, even if they are in psychosis somehow. So I have this very weird question. Can John be a part of this meeting? Yes, for me it's about equality, yes?
Yeah.
I had this training from WHO about advanced treatment plan, and patient is a part of the team in discussing his treatment plan. So I'm just questioning if it is a possibility that he can be a part of this every week meeting, because it's a trust, yes?
Yeah, I think this is a really big thing that we've gone backwards and forwards with actually and Lucy, you might have some other ideas, but we've gone backwards and forwards within our wards, and we've also done lots of sort of consultation and speaking with service users about their perspectives in terms of, is it okay for us to have conversations about you and think about you when you're not there? Would you like to be there? And I know some of the other trusts have done some research around this, and one trust tried to invite service users into all of the team formulation meetings, and actually a lot of the feedback was people found it very, very unhelpful because it was so overwhelming, having so many people there in such an intense environment. So I guess what we've sort of done is a bit of a two-step process. So thinking about this as around a supervisory space, a bit of a space for staff to start to have some initial thinking, but also the parallel side to that is how we also involve John in those conversations. But I don't know what you think, Lucy.
It's a really good question, and there are people who run team formulation meetings who regularly have the service user in the room, and they're set up a little bit differently. So, you know, there's no set way of practice of running such a meeting. I think there is a problem when you have someone who's perhaps recently arrived on the ward who is really, really not capable of sitting in a meeting and is highly disturbed and distressed, and yet the staff still need to have some kind of idea about what's going on, or else they'll just say acute psychotic breakdown, lots and lots of medication. So there are situations, I think, when you definitely need to have a meeting when the service user definitely is not able to be there because they're not in the right state of mind. But I also think there isn't an absolute distinction between if you're in the meeting, you're involved, if you're out of the meeting, you're not involved, because we all know it's possible to have meetings where the service user voice isn't really heard at all. It's a meeting to tell them what their problem is and tell them to take their drugs. And I think you can also have meetings where for various reasons they may not be in the room, but they know beforehand, they feed into the meeting, they are told what the meeting is about, they are invited to give their thoughts about what the meeting has come up with. And I think it depends whether you see the team formulation meeting mainly as a form of supervision, which is sort of the model you're doing, which I think is the best model where the staff are still thinking in very narrow medical ways, and whether you see it as we've reached a stage where the staff have moved quite a long way, none of us are thinking in narrow medical ways, we're all constructing a narrative together. That'd be more of an open dialogue method, wouldn't it? Nothing about me without me, which is the ideal. That is the ideal. But if you think about open dialogue, then it means the whole team goes off and gets trained in a completely different way. And actually what we're talking about here is very exhausted, overstretched staff with no training money and not trained in open dialogue. And we want to change the culture sometimes. But it's a really important question to which there's no absolute answer, and we need to keep it under review. Don't know if that makes sense. You will have different views on that, of course you will. Should we? I mean, we've had quite a long, intense afternoon, so we could say the last few minutes off you to come and admire the stabilisation manuals if you want. But and Faye and I are here if you want to come and have a chat. But shall we have? Is there a last question or a last?
Yeah, if there's nobody else, if I can ask one last question.
Please do.
So I was wondering how how does it go on from here? Because usually I imagine somebody gets a diagnosis and they are released from the psychiatric ward, and they might find a therapist and they will work with that diagnosis, for example, depression. If you don't give him a diagnosis, John gets out and he needs a therapist, how does he work with him? Would he get this sheet basically from you, whatever you worked out with him? Would you forward that to the therapist? How do you work with that?
Well, you don't need a diagnosis to work with people. It's the first answer. In fact, it's a hindrance. So it doesn't matter that hasn't got a diagnosis. It's a good thing. I'll let Faye explain this a bit more, but there will be various versions of this formulation, and at some point, a version that John is happy with will go in the notes. Now, that doesn't have to be a detailed one. There might be lots of personal things he doesn't want to share, but it'd be enough information to let whoever works with him in the future have some understanding of, I see you've had a very difficult time, John, and I see that you've been trying to get your life together in this way, this way, this way. And that's the basis for the next team or a therapist or whoever else is working with him. I don't know if I answered your question. Do you want to add to that?
I think that pretty much, covers.
Yeah. But actually, this is the plan, and there'll be various versions of it, and we might have another team meeting about John when he's feeling a bit stronger and when we know more about him, and we might have a more detailed plan that we've drawn up with him, and he'll be several stages down the road. And he might have his own personal version of this. Someone might do a one-to-one formulation with him on the ward, and he'll have his own letter, which doesn't go in the notes, but it says something like, over the last few weeks, we've got to know each other. This is our shared understanding of your story. And often people find those kind of letters very valuable and important to them, and a reminder of what they've learned and what they've been through. So there are various ways forward, and this is the first step along the journey, if you like.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I mean, I agree, you don't need a diagnosis. I was just wondering how the transfer of information works.
So we always try and have, they're called in the UK care coordinators, or your named worker from the community team would attend the meeting, as well as someone perhaps from the crisis resolution and home treatment team. So we're sort of always thinking about that sort of flow as people move through our services, and that the core people who are important to hold that story are there. But it's an imperfect system. There's lots of work still in thinking about that.
But it is, I mean, ideally this shapes the rest of John's journey through services, but what typically happens is every team starts from scratch. Who's John? Oh, I see, history of depression, try this drug. You know, the formulation is meant to be the thread that runs through whatever else happens, you know, shared in a form that's acceptable to John. And, you know, people don't like telling their story all over again to every next person they meet either, do they? It leads to very fragmented care. So this is meant to be a way of avoiding that kind of thing. Surprisingly common in UK services. Most services will have some version of a team formulation going on, not necessarily quite like this. So, and I've been to quite a few other countries, and when I describe formulation, they all look surprised and say, really? But, you know, this is not controversial practice in the UK. I mean, this particular way of doing it isn't the way everybody does it, but the idea that you need a formulation process of various kinds is standard in mental health services in the UK, although it runs alongside a lot of very traditional narrow diagnostic practice. It's not mostly it's not a replacement for it. So, what do you think, Faze? We've all worked very hard, particularly the role players. Do feel free to come and have a look at the manuals. Do feel free to come and have a chat with us. And I think there's a social event this evening, isn't there? So may see you there. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.